Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Policy Driven, a podcast on global transport and mobility policy. My name is Thomas Jérémy Haine-Lefebvre, and I'm joined by my co-host Mark Watts and Fanny Devaux, Director of Shipping at Transport and Environment, for a very timely special episode on the International Maritime Organization's recent MEPC. Welcome both.
Thank you, Tom.
Thank you, Tom. Hi, Mark.
Hi there, Fanny.
Before we take a deep dive into today's topic, I think it's really important to let our listeners know a little bit more about you. Fanny, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you started working in the maritime sector?
Yeah, absolutely. So, as you said, Tom, I'm Fanny Devaux. I'm the Director of Shipping at Transport and Environment, also known as TNE. And I've been working on maritime policy for the last decade, around 9 years, focusing mainly on shipping regulation. I worked in the European Parliament side for a European agency and also at some national institution in France. Interesting background that not a lot of people know is actually I was in the Navy, in the French Navy for a couple of years. I served as a reservist and I still have the status today. And that actually was kind of the kickstart of my passion for maritime regulation in the maritime world. But yes, today at TNE, what we do with the shipping team, we're around 20 people, is quite straightforward, really, is to push for policies that will help decarbonize shipping, whether at the IMO or the EU level.
Really interesting. And how did you get to become a Navy reservist? Was it always written in the sky, or was it? Did you sign up by accident, or what was it?
No, it was definitely not by accident. I was always interested by the maritime world, the sea. I'm very lucky to have been brought up near the coast, so in the south of France. So I was always very interested by that part. And when you're interested in politics in general, maritime world is glorious because you have a lot of geopolitics, you have diplomacy, but you also have environment. So it's a bit of everything. And I was always very interested by that angle. Defense came quite naturally because I really like operations and being very concretely on the ground. And I thought it was a very interesting challenge for me. So it's actually usually engineers who do that training, but I got in and it was a fantastic 18 months. I loved it. And since then, I always try to do some missions, as they call it, for the French Navy. But beyond that, it's giving me really the perspective on how important our maritime world is for the EU. I mean, for France, but for the EU and the world in general. The EU has the biggest coastline of all countries, all organizations in the world. So we have a really big role to play in that perspective. Yeah.
Mark, my question to you is, did you join the Navy? If not, why not?
Well, because I love flying. So I actually joined the Air Cadets many years ago.
Voila.
But I did that for a while. But in the end, I had to choose between military and discipline, which I was never very good at, or going to the sort of anarchic world of politics. And I took the politics path. It's too early to tell you whether that worked or not. But I just think you can't do both. So I went into politics, and the rest is history. And as you know, but also always fascinated by maritime as well. And I grew up, as you know, in a very maritime area, Kent. One of my key political constituencies in Kent was Dover, the port of Dover in particular. And a bit like Fanny, really, that these were always big things in my mind, more in safety than environment. And that's because we were shaped by the shock of the loss of the Herald of Free Enterprise in the late 80s, when it sank with a loss of 193 lives. And those of us in Kent just found that unbelievable, that how do we get to that point when ships were basically sailing without proper regulation? I mean, that's really what that was caused by. And that influenced my political career as well. I
really share a lot with that, with what you two have mentioned. from my perspective, I have to admit, between maritime and aviation, I was more of an aviation guy. In fact, I did a master's degree in aviation management, so I think it's, I went the extra mile in that sense. But I didn't sign up to the cadets, but I did think about it. I think I pestered my mom when I was about 12, 13 years old. And,
but were you in the scouts or something instead?
I was for a few years, yeah. When I lived in Tanzania, we had the scouts. I had it was a scouts honor, if I remember. So that's the closest I got to the defense sector when I was young. But it's certainly certainly a very interesting part of the ecosystem, I think, be it on maritime aviation and land transportation as well. But that, unfortunately, is a bit irrelevant to the IMO, our topic of conversation today. And I would really like to move on to it, but I think it's important that we take a step back, especially for listeners who might not be completely aware of what the IMO is. Like ICAO in the aviation sector, it's extremely complicated. And for those listeners less familiar, I would like to provide a very brief history lesson, if I may. The International Maritime Organization, or IMO, is a UN body established in the 50s to develop and maintain a global regulatory framework for international shipping, covering safety, which Mark mentioned as an important topic, legal, and later environmental matters. Within that structure, the IMO established the Marine Environment Protection Committee, or MEPC, which is responsible for addressing the environmental impacts of shipping. And at its 83rd session, MEPC 83, which took place in April 2025, the IMO approved in principle, I think it's important to note that, approved in principle, a net zero framework, or NZF, or NZF for our friends in North America, with the objective of introducing a global system to reduce and price maritime emissions, with application initially expected in 2028. The framework agreed at MEPC 83 combined two elements. First, an economic measure, under which ships would face emissions-related costs, including payments to a newly created fund called the IMO Net Zero Fund. And those revenues would be used in part to support vulnerable countries, including small island states and least developed countries. Secondly, there was a technical measure called the Global Fuel Standard, also known as the GFI. We love acronyms in international transportation, requiring ships to reduce their greenhouse gas and fuel intensity over time based on a well-to-wake methodology. While often compared to a system such as the EU Emissions Trading System, or ETS, another acronym, the approach is a bit different, combining elements of a pricing mechanism with a regulatory standard. Adoption had been initially envisaged at the extraordinary IMO session in late 2025. That session, known as MEPC/ES2, again, we love acronyms in global maritime, did take place in October 2025, but ended without an agreement after 57 member states voted to adjourn the discussions for 1 year, with 49 voting against the adjournment and 21 abstaining. Opposition was led mostly by the United States and Saudi Arabia, although other countries such as the UAE, Panama, and Liberia also opposed the framework at the time. That left us until last week, where the IMO's MEPC met for MEPC 84 from the 27th of April to the 1st of May, and where nearly 100 delegations took the floor to voice their views on the net zero framework. While there's no new agreement was reached, the majority of member states reaffirmed the NZF as the basis for further work, and the committee agreed to establish an intersessional working group to resolve outstanding concerns ahead of the next session. The next session is planned for December 4th, and is at that session where formal adoption could, in theory, take place. Fanny, I'd love to hear your initial thoughts on what happened over the weekend. I'm sure we have lots of things happening over the weekend, but what happened in maritime?
Yeah, so we were in London this week, seeing in real life what was unfolding in MEPC 84. And what happened is not a breakthrough by any means, but it is a survival of the net zero framework. So it could have been basically the end of hope for the framework, and what we saw was definitely the opposite, which was an interesting contrast to the preceding session in October, where you mentioned it, Tom, the US, some other allied governments, including Saudis, put immense pressure on all the other delegations to prevent the adoption of the framework. What we saw this week is the opposite. It's a clear majority of government giving a clear signal that they still want to commit to a global framework. Will this framework be exactly like the NZF originally was? Probably not. We will work on some flexibilities, some adjustments so that every delegation feels comfortable adopting it. But definitely we escaped the risk of collapse. And politically, I think it's a very strong signal that a majority of countries still want a global deal.
On a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being the net zero framework is dead and 10 being it's fully alive and functional, where would you place it?
Before April, before this session, this week, I would say it was a 3. And now I would say it's a 6. So a bit more optimistic. Still not close to the 10, but, optimistic.
Mark, do you agree with Fanny's assessment there, or do you have a different view?
Well, I wasn't there, and I really respect and appreciate the fact that Fanny there was on the ground, and I think the mood music was, as Fanny said, much more positive this time. However, we still didn't get the deal, and we're still frustrated by that. But that's not a reason to give up, and we've got to keep fighting for high ambition and an international standard. I mean, my view on this, though, is slightly, I guess, influenced by my interest in economics and also politics. That I think we shouldn't lose sight of the causes of the problems at the IMO are not technical, they're political, and that there are people in the world, including many voters, who are, for whatever reason, sometimes good reason, getting tired of or losing faith in climate change mitigation. And we may not agree with them, but we have to accept that. And it's not just the White House, it's all across the world. There is growing concern about the personal cost of climate change measures. And there's a cliche in Europe, no one will be left behind, but a lot of people fear they are being left behind. The second one is, I think this is the more positive thing, despite all that, a lot of industry, shipping, ports, infrastructure companies and governments are getting on with it. And I think that's also really a positive trend. I think World Shipping Council estimated that liner shipping alone has invested $150 billion in dual fuel vessels over the last couple of years. Now, that's not a perfect answer, it's not the only answer, but it's a signal that the industry are really determined to tackle climate change quite rightly. It's their responsibility primarily. So I think there's good and bad coming of it. The bad is we've still got to tackle the underlying unease citizens understandably have about the economic cost of climate change mitigation. You can't, in my view, have of climate justice without social justice. Secondly, we shouldn't despair because a lot of good work is going on. And I think one almost cart before the horse, maybe the industry almost measures will force ultimately an ambitious net zero agreement at the IMO level because the industry is increasingly demanding it. So they're my immediate reactions, Tom. It's not all bad, in other words.
Fanny, do you have any reactions to what Mark just said? Because I think there's a few things, but I'd like to hear your first thoughts.
No, I'd like to come back on the social justice aspect, and I think we definitely align with Mark on that. We at the IMO concretely it illustrates like the fact that we have to have that fund, the Net Zero Fund, and the fund is going to be targeted mainly towards smaller states and developing countries, and I think that's very key in the political acceptability of the framework. And in making sure we have everybody onboarded for the shipping decarbonization. And I think this is true for many of the climate mitigation measures that we're seeing, whether it's ETS2 or others, where we definitely need to work more on the social aspect than what has been done in the past. That's a big lesson, I think, from the Green Deal and those years of a lot of green measures, is that now we have to work with some flexibility for the industry so that it also makes sense for them, but also for the citizen.
On this topic of a fund, there's been some criticism from some stakeholders that the IMO, is not a bank. It's not the IMF. It's not the World Bank. It's not a donor organization, and that this would fundamentally change its mandate. Is that argument still salient in the discussions at the IMO today? Is it one of the main concerns that are ongoing, or has it been dealt with?
I don't think it's been dealt with adequately. So I think what you're bringing, Tom, is a very important point. There are concerns about the IMO being able to run that fund, because we're talking about approximately a $10 billion fund yearly. So it's no small amount of money. And And to be fair, the IMO has not shown any kind of practical guidance on how that fund could be run. And you know, I do share the concern that there's always a risk when you create another fund. That's just another burden, another institution, and especially at the UN level, it's always a bit scary. You have 100 delegations and more on the line, so you know those things take time and it's very complex. So it is a true concern, but on that very point, I don't think there is any other way to do it. It's very important that that fund exists, so that if it's not that fund run by the IMO, then it's up to them to be creative and come up with another solution where we can give back to the just and transition, the just and equitable transition. Sorry.
Mark, you were a politician. At the time, you didn't, as far as I'm aware, didn't have to push forward funds that fundamentally your constituents would have to pay for decarbonization or support in faraway lands. Politically, how challenging is that for a politician to defend, if at all?
Well, I've been thinking about this a lot recently because, you know, as someone who's knocked on the doorsteps over many, many years, you know, and you only got to look at the opinion polls now, one of the biggest concerns is the cost of living crisis. Climate change is still there, but people are just trying to struggle with their bills, you know, paying the mortgage, paying for the kids, just surviving. And sometimes I think in Brussels, we underestimate that feeling of how the anxiety that there is on a lot of ordinary households all across the EU and indeed beyond. So often the way the media portray climate change mitigation, even though it to us makes sense, and in the end it will save money because we'll be less reliant on people like Russia, it's often portrayed by the media as a cost and a burden. And if you look at what's happening in the automobile industry, I don't want to digress, but you know, there it's the fear of job losses because you know we're phasing out, quite rightly, fossil fuel cars in favor of electric cars. But it's often portrayed negatively, and clearly people pick up on that anxiety. So what I think we need more empathy. And Fanny made the point about this pretty broad agreement actually in Europe that social justice component needs to align itself with the ambition which we must retain to get to net zero by 2050. This is why I get frustrated with things like the Innovation Fund and the 10 million euros that shipping are paying into the ETS, which is all great, but there's no visible sign of it on the ground. That doesn't mean it's not on the ground, but there's no visible sign. And so we've got to win back the trust of the voters, of communities, of society as a whole, and demonstrate the money, be it ETS or indeed the global fund, which ultimately we want, because it only makes sense for the global fund, but it will benefit not just communities or companies, but citizens as well. I think we've got to do some really heavy lifting and heavy thinking this year about how that can work. And Fanny is right. I think the rush to get the Green Deal agreed, and it was done in record time, quite rightly, the social and economic component really wasn't fully thought through. And it's the same for the IMO as well. I think the heavy lifting actually should be done more, not on the technical standards, because I think there's great work going on the technical side. It's on the economic side. And the risk is that they decided to detach it from the technical measures, and that may work, but then the measure itself won't actually have a lot of coherence or meaning, because you've got to address that social justice issue, particularly for the less developed countries. And for me, it goes, and just to wrap up, it goes back to the heart of the matter, which is the cause, and that's the growing dissatisfaction with not just climate change mitigation, but the rules-based international order. I mean, this is a perfect job for the UN, perfect job for the IMO, but we've lost faith. And we've got to restore faith in our global institutions. I mean, that's an enormous challenge, isn't it? But we have to do it because the alternative is pretty scary. So sorry to answer it in a sort of a holistic way, looking at the politics and the and indeed the geopolitics. But as I said, you can't detach one from the other. You can't have a technical measure at the IMO without sorting out the economics, and you can't sort out the economics if we don't sort out the way in which we govern our planet. And I'd like to see much more attention in Brussels on how we can restore confidence in global governance.
Speaking about Brussels, a lot of stakeholders have said that if the IMO reaches a deal on the net zero framework, then the EU will have to revisit, if not even abandon, its various maritime-related climate legislation, be that the EU ETS, which regulates the emissions, or Fuel EU Maritime, which focuses more on fuel. How realistic is that today, this week? will those people's wishes be met by Christmas, or is that highly unlikely?
Yeah, that's the very crucial question this week and in the past month. Will they align? Will they not? And how? I think alignment will only happen if the IMO delivers something of comparable ambition with credibility and actual enforceability. Because there's the true question about, will the IMO framework, if it happens, be enforceable? So that's one aspect that's very important. Maybe to go back a bit deeply into the different texts, you have Fuel EU. So Fuel EU is one of the texts that has basically imposes fuel standards. The IMO is trying to integrate fuel standards. And in Fuel EU Maritime Regulation, at Article 30, so that's the review article, it actually says concretely, if the IMO has a fuel standard agreement, then we will look into aligning the Fuel EU text, basically to avoid the duplication of regulation of those fuels. So it's very clearly stated in Fuel EU. On ETS, it's not stated as clearly, but the review is happening now in July. We're expecting the review text 15th of July. Ideally, would have been after an IMO deal. It's clearly not happening. But the Commission has hinted at the fact that if there were to have an IMO agreement, the ETS would align of some sort. It's when I say align, because a lot of different stakeholders have different take on the alignment. When I say align, I mean the fact that the emissions wouldn't be counted twice, not a disappearance or a deletion of the ETS as a whole. The US has been calling for that on our soil or on our waters, for that matter. So they're definitely not contradictory, those systems. If anything, they complement each other. Our data at TNE shows that if the two models were to coexist, the overlap would be of 15% of the emission. So those emissions, we could definitely have a rebate on them to do it. But we would definitely not like to see the EU rolling back on that shipping regulation, because we don't expect the IMO to be of comparable ambition.
So in concrete terms, if you were a betting person, would you bet that we would have two systems coexist for the long term?
Yeah, and actually I would go beyond than that. We won't have only two systems. I think we would have a lot of regional measures coexisting. You have a lot of different countries in the world that are looking at their shipping ETS. China is developing its ETS. Japan, Brazil, Turkey, the UK, of course, has a shipping ETS that just got adopted. Canada is also looking into it. So we have many different regional measures that are being developed, inspired by the EU ETS or just from their own regulatory framework. So we're definitely seeing that sort of regional governance. There's also a carbon market in Eastern Africa, being Djibouti, Gabon, and a few other countries that have joined that initiatives. So we're seeing just a flurry of those regional governance. So I think in the future, if the IMO doesn't have a strong ambition and have a higher speed, let's say, of implementation, I think we will see those systems coexist. And just maybe to give you an idea, even if the NZF is agreed next autumn, the full implementation won't be before 2032. So we're talking until still quite a few years before just the implementation, not even reaching the targets. So I think it still makes sense during this time to have those regional frameworks pushing the global ambition.
I'm still reflecting on that, Tom, because I think that there's not enough people, certainly in Brussels, understand that 2032 date that Fanny has just highlighted, and also very clear and excellent explanation of what's happening at IMO and globally. And that's why I'm so passionate about, we don't wait to 2032, and we don't, industry doesn't wait. It's got to get on with decarbonizing whatever tool it uses in the decarbonisation toolbox, whatever pathway it wants to follow in terms of which energy choice. But the industry can't just wait for another IMO MEPC session, can't wait for so-called regulatory certainty, because you're never going to have that. I agree with alignment, and I agree with what Fanny said, that we need a strong, ambitious agreement that can hopefully coordinate all these regional schemes, and in some cases replace them, but maybe not fully. But we can't just wait around, because by 2032, we've already gone past the 2030 deadline we set ourselves for substantial cuts in greenhouse gas emissions. So I said, that's why I'm pleased that some people in the industry, a lot of key stakeholders, are taking measures now. And I think that's also the other message, that industry's got to keep pressure on the IMO, but they've also got to demonstrate their continuing commitment to invest in climate change mitigation, because you've just illustrated very, very clearly, you can't just wait to 2032 and then everything. Those very precious 6 years need to be used to reduce GHG.
Yeah, from my perspective, I'd just like to add, when we had the delay effectively last year, a lot of stakeholders in the private sector and the Commission effectively accepted, at least in my view, a bit of a delay, a bit of a, let's pause and see what happens. Based on what you've said, though, that patience or that leniency cannot be repeated long term. I mean, you cannot repeat patience and leniency for the next 6 years. Do you think that we are seeing reviews of ETS and Fuel EU in the coming years? Do you think that industry stakeholders should prepare for a more stringent regulation in the short and medium term, followed by alignment? Or do you think there will be pressure to maintain the status quo until 2032 and then talk about alignment?
I think what we'll see in the upcoming reviews is more probably expansion of scopes, but with more flexibility. So it sounds a little bit contradictory, but I think it makes a lot of sense for the industry. If you look at the shipping industry, all of the regulation at the EU level starts from 5,000 GT. That's a measure with which we calculate the sizes of boats. And it's usually quite large ships, because you start at already quite large measurements. So what we ask is that all of these regulations apply basically to all ships, or much smaller ships, from 400 gross tonnage, 400 GTs. Doesn't include individual personal boats, so don't worry about your Samo boats, but it's still commercial ships, but all of them. So that may sound like more constraints, because obviously we're opening the scope, but we are adding a lot of flexibility in a lot of different places. One very easy one is that, for example, reporting deadlines for ETS and reporting deadlines for Fuel EU Maritime are not aligned. There are 2 months separation, and you can't copy paste the software for the data. Very basic operational matter, but actually changing that, aligning that, will have a huge impact on the ship owners and the industry. Having better verification clauses, having easier or lighter MRV requirements. MRV is the system on which the ETS is based. Many different small operational tweaks like this will make a world of a difference for the ship owners actually reporting those emissions. So that's the direction we're going with those revision. There'll be a temptation from a part in the industry, and not the majority, I'd like to add, to roll back on some of them. But generally, I think the trend is quite generally to go towards that extension with some flexibility. The biggest flexibility we'd like to see is a use of some of the revenue of those systems going back to decarbonization solutions. We've seen France, for example, opening a call for tender. So with around 66 million euros for this year, being used only for projects that have concrete shipping decarbonization impacts. And that's the type of projects we'd like to see, because it really puts the money where the industry needs it. So not just back in the ship owner's pocket, but actually on the projects that matter.
Yeah.
You mentioned the expansion of scope. I guess one question, just going back to something we talked about before, is this aspect of social acceptance and communication. I presume that the operators of smaller boats may not really appreciate the new regulation. Do you think, are you expecting any pushback on that? And more broadly, do you think that the authorities that be are doing enough work to communicate and explain it to them, or are we just heading for some sort of crisis in shipping policy?
No, I don't think we're going towards a crisis. A lot of them actually already have some reporting requirements. So, for example, for general cargo or offshore vessels, those have been already included at a smaller scope. So for them, it's already daily life. Now they just have the pricing element on top of the reporting. And administrative burden is something that's very high on the agenda. It's always something we consider. And we always show options to policymaker on how to reduce it if there is any. So what our data has shown is that actually that administrative burden is very limited. And in the case for those segments where it's very small owners, for example, you own 1-2 ships, it could be quite hard to do that reporting. Then that responsibility should be on the fuel supplier and not on the ship owners. So we're kind of changing that responsibility, and the fuel supplier then it becomes just under the ETS2 framework, which is slightly different but has the same pricing and is basically the same rule, but with someone else having the burden of the proof. But then we get quite technical. But just for you to know that the burden part of it is definitely something that's always very high in the policymaker's mind. So we always come up with a solution when we suggest something. And just to specify maybe that the Commission actually in 2018, when they suggested the first all of the package of the shipping regulation, they had in mind to put it from 400 GT already. And they had somewhat accepted to put it to 5,000 for the bigger ones for a transition period. So it's very expected from a lot of the industry that we go back to that threshold. So I think they also had time to prepare themselves.
Mark, do you have any reactions to all that?
Well, again, it's very heartening to hear this. I guess one of the lessons I'm drawing for this whole episode, the last couple of months, really from MEPC 83 through to 84, is actually there's a lot in common between all the different stakeholder strands, but industry, NGOs, politics, communities across the EU and indeed beyond. I mean, we focus on the divisions and the differences, and that gets polarized obviously by the media. There's a huge consensus on this in these areas. I mean, what we're hearing now, I think, from Fanny is very important. We want simplification without reducing standards. That can be delivered. As you say, broadening the scope was already in the original measure. There's no surprise there. Selling this, I think that's the key thing, Tom, that we've not been very good at selling it in the last few years. And again, I don't want to jump and go down the automobile rabbit hole, but we don't want to see a repeat of that, where the EU established clear guardrails for electrification, and then we injected uncertainty into that. The last thing industry wants, the last thing the NGOs want, the last thing our citizens want at this point is uncertainty or even losing our nerve. We want continuity until the IMO hopefully can take over some of these measures. But from what we're hearing, in the meantime, we want a stable but a simplified regulatory framework that maintains the ambition. So one of the takeaways one of the conclusions I'm reaching when I'm talking to stakeholders, people like Fanny and others, is we need to align more closely. We need to work together, and we need to demonstrate that consensus exists. So when these things come up for review, we're confident that there is widespread public acceptance for measures like ETS. Until that day when maybe the IMO is ambitious enough and takes them over. What we don't want is Europe losing faith with measures like ETS. Subject to, and again, Fanny's made the same point I would make, that we've got to get more clarity about what happens to those ETS receipts. It's great that France is doing what it's doing, but other member states also have to follow that lead. More transparency, more allocation of maritime receipts to the maritime industry, but also the wider maritime communities, as you say, Fanny, so that the ordinary people see the real difference too. So a huge amount of consensus in Brussels, and I think we've just got to demonstrate that to the decision makers over the next couple of years.
Fanny, your concluding thoughts about all of this. What should our listeners, be they policymakers, MEPs, ship owners, operators, what should they take away from what happened last week for the next 12 to 24 months?
Maybe one thing is that the international cooperation is not broken. It's fragile, but it's not broken. And we can't, if you allow me the sentence, we can still stand up to the Trump administration. I mean, they wanted that deal killed, and it's still there. It's still on the table, very much open. We saw a lot of adhesion and support for it. And maybe allow me to end on a positive note. We haven't talked a lot about it, but actually this week was also the adoption of a new emission control area. So they're called ECAs. We have a few, and this one is going to be fully implemented in September 28th. And it covers the economic exclusive zones of France, Ireland, Portugal, Spain, and the UK. I think it actually goes towards Ireland also, including Ireland. And basically, it's the largest ECA ever created, the largest emission control zone ever created. And it introduces binding targets on sulfur, nitrogen, and particulate matters. And the impact of those are really not theoretical. We've seen huge impact on the Mediterranean Sea, and for that northern Atlantic sea, we'll probably see a lot of, key pollutants being reduced, death avoided, and just huge health benefits. So I think we can. We can't throw the baby with the bathwater. Even if the Net Zero Framework doesn't happen, the IMO can still do things like, for example, the emission control areas.
That's really insightful. Mark, your concluding thoughts, if I may.
I've been really cheered up by this conversation. I think there's a huge amount of consensus. There's a lot of work to be done. Those of us are, like Fanny as well, want the ambitious IMO Net Zero Framework to be agreed. We've got to work on that. But meanwhile, we don't have to wait. We can be getting on with things like the ECA that's been mentioned, the technical standards that are moving forward, and here in Europe, continuing to roll out Fuel EU and ETS and driving global change as well. And above all, making the case for the rules-based international system. But it won't make its case on its own. We have to go out there fighting for it. We have to address any concerns people have, and we have to refine and change and reform institutions like the UN and the IMO along the way. And maybe the final word, if I may, Tom, tell industry, those that are moving fast, move further forward, and those that are not moving, move fast. Don't wait. Waiting is not a plan, and it's really good to have this consensus that there's clear signals here that everyone has a role to play. We're all roughly heading in the same direction, and we should perhaps be much more optimistic than we were this time last year.
Well, thank you, Mark, for that. Thank you, Fanny, for joining us. And if I may add my 2 cents, I'd say what surprised me the most of this past week was the weakness of the no's. I honestly thought, and I'm quite pessimistic as a person, I honestly thought that the Net Zero Framework was dead after what happened last year. But it seems that alliance hasn't really survived. The alliance of the unwilling, if you will. And there's a tacit, quiet alliance of the willing. So perhaps this is a sign of a quiet majority of stakeholders and countries who are still in favor of multilateralism. So thank you so much for that, for the positive note, and Fanny for your insights. So thank you, and for Mark. So thank you very much, Fanny, for joining us on this special episode of Policy Driven. We look forward to welcoming you at a future episode as well.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Tom.
Pleasure.
Thank you, Fanny. Thanks so much. Goodbye.
Bye.
Goodbye.